From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason Mclure. Most people probably know little about the tiny South American nation of Guyana. But recently, Guyana has been in the news for more positive reasons. That's because ExxonMobil has made one of the most promising offshore oil discoveries there in decades. Now, Guyana is covered mostly in tropical forest, and it borders Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname. Right now, it's one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, but that's about to change. To put things in perspective, Guyana has fewer than 800,000 people, and the total annual output of its economy last year was about $3.5 billion. The potential market value of the oil find, as much as $120 billion to more than $180 billion. But the sudden discovery of all this cash under its seabed holds a lot of risk for Guyana. In some oil-rich countries like Angola and Nigeria, most of the population has gotten no real benefit from their country's oil wealth. And right next door to Guyana is Venezuela. There, the economy has collapsed in spite of the fact that it has the world's largest proven oil reserves. So on this edition of Global Journalist, a look at Guyana's big find and whether it can avoid the so-called resource curse. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from some people who have been following this issue closely from a couple of different angles. First, we're joined by Samuel Sukhnandan in Georgetown, Guyana. He's a senior journalist at the Guyana Times and Television Guyana's Evening News. Samuel, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, tell us, if you would, about sort of what the mood is in Guyana. What are people feeling about this big oil discovery?
Okay, well, since the oil discovery, there have been some level of excitement, but people are not too excited as well because Guyana is a mineral-rich resource country. We're exporters of bauxite, gold, diamond, and forestry products, byproducts. So we have been, over the years, having companies come in here and invest, but we haven't really seen much benefits from it. The oil discovery, of course, has created a debate and discussion among the Guyanese populace. We do look forward to first oil in 2020, but it all depends on how well the government manages the resources it gains from this new sector.
Well, I want to talk about how the government is managing this in just a moment, but one issue I think we should touch on first is that I understand that there is a territorial dispute between Guyana and its neighbor Venezuela that actually dates back centuries. Tell us just briefly about that.
Sure. Well, this issue, yes, like you said, since 1966, Venezuela laid claim on the entire Essequibo region that covers about 2/3 of Guyana's territory, and the water off its coast, including part of the Stabroek Block, where most of the major oil discoveries were made by ExxonMobil. Our political analysts and other commentators have been speaking about this issue in Guyana, but from all indications, it seems that the matter came back when ExxonMobil made the discovery of oil in Guyana in probably 2015-16, and ever since that issue has been ongoing. However, there is not much fear, I would say, from the people here in Guyana because the saying is that we have support from the U.S. ExxonMobil is a U.S. company. We also have the support of the United Kingdom when it comes to the border controversy. That matter has been sent to the International Court of Justice, and we are already making plans to go there. So there is some level of uneasiness, in terms of the border issue, but it doesn't seem that it will create any major conflict because right now, the Venezuelan government is not have their back against the wall based on all the sanctions and all the issues they're currently facing.
Sure, Venezuela has a number of other issues ongoing at the moment, but you had touched on a moment ago about some of the transparency issues, about how the government has negotiated this production contract with ExxonMobil. Talk to us just a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. Well, in all fairness, the government has been, it's a fairly new government, a coalition government rather, something that is new to Guyana, but it has been making the necessary plans. It has looked at its neighbor, Trinidad and Tobago, a Caribbean neighbor, other examples in Africa, in Europe, in Canada, but there have been some issues in relation to how they go about making it more accountable and transparent, especially with the discovery of them placing $18 million as sign-in bonus receipt from ExxonMobil since 2016. After public pressure, after the release of an article, one that I did in relation to that, the government had no option but to say that they did set up a private account to have the US $18 million, and they did receive it about a year ago. Instead, they should have placed it into the consolidated fund. A private citizen who happens to be the head of the Transparency International body here, the Guyanese arm body, he has filed a legal challenge against the government to have them place that money into the consolidated fund. The opposition has also filed a lawsuit in the court, which is supposed to come up, I think, between this week and next week most likely. So yeah, since that discovery that there was a US $18 million sign-in bonus, the government was pressured even more to release the contract, having lied about having the bonus placed in a private account in the central bank.
And so the government was pressured into releasing this deal that it made with ExxonMobil after it had been reported that there had been this sort of secret payment stashed in Guyana's central bank by the government. But so what do we know about that contract when it was released? How did people react to it?
Oh, well, there are still ongoing debates about it. Only last week they released other contracts. I think the CGX contract, Orange Duke block. But in terms of the ExxonMobil contract, there have been concerns about the production sharing agreement. While the minister had said when commercial oil production begins in Guyana, Guyana could earn at least US $1 million daily, or just over US $300 million annually. It may seem as big money for a small third world country, but given the resources that was found, many persons have come out saying that Guyana has really struck a bad deal. The first agreement signed in 1997 on the previous government accepted a 1% royalty. The new government signed a new contract in 2016, accepting 2% royalty. So even the IMF has recommended a review of the production sharing agreement between the government and ExxonMobil, so aimed at getting a higher share of profit oil as the profitability of projects an increase.
So in other words, it sounds like there are still some questions within Guyana as to whether or not the government negotiated as good an agreement with ExxonMobil as they could. Obviously, ExxonMobil needs to make back the money they've spent doing all their exploration work in Guyana.
That's correct.
Well, Samuel, thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason Mclure. We're talking today about a major offshore oil discovery in the South American nation of Guyana, and whether an oil find that's dozens of times larger than the country's gross domestic product will be a blessing or a curse. Now, to broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in a couple other people who have been following this story. Joining us from Bogota, Colombia, is Raul Gallegos. He's an associate director at Control Risks, a global risk consulting firm, and the author of the book Crude Nation: How Oil Riches Ruined Venezuela. Also joining us in London today is Nick Butler. He's a former executive at the oil company BP. He's now a visiting professor at King's College London. Welcome to both of you. Raul Gallegos, let me start with you. You've compared what's happening in Guyana to a homeless person winning the lottery. How is that analogous?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Basically, what you're seeing in Guyana is a similar situation to what you've seen in a number of other oil-rich countries. It's, in many cases, countries that don't have strong institutions, that don't have a history of managing their finances properly, a history of properly investing their money and properly managing their affairs, if you will, and also countries that have enormous poverty. And so it is a very big challenge for these countries to all of a sudden be in discovering enormous amounts of money, and how to properly manage that money, and prevent specific elite interests from taking control of that cash. I think Venezuela, which has been a country that for 100 years has had an oil industry, if you will, has continuously struggled with this, particularly because when Venezuela discovered oil, it was, a similar analogy could have been made. It was a country that wasn't ready for it, if you will. And, my point is that just as human beings are not ready to all of a sudden be thrust in a situation where they have an enormous amount of money, nations are in a similar boat, if you will. If you're a human being that has a number of defects like all of us have, and if you happen to have a tendency for a certain type of addiction, say alcoholic or drugs or what have you, if all of a sudden you are in a situation where you inherit an enormous amount of money, if you're not ready for it, it can destroy you. You could end up misspending it, you could end up being kidnapped, and a number of other people hit you for money. It can be really a nightmare if you're not equipped for it. So I think the same applies to countries. All countries that have discovered enormous amounts of a natural resource are not normal countries, if you will, in the way that human beings who all of a sudden inherit $300 million are also not in a normal situation. It's a big burden and a big responsibility. And only the ones that are careful and methodical about.
Well, I'm sorry if I could just turn this back to you, Samuel. We just briefly lost Raul Gallegos' audio there for a moment. Samuel, Raul was saying that countries have to be sort of careful and methodical about handling this type of situation when they have such a large amount of money coming in. Do you get the sense that Guyana's government is approaching this in that way?
I think so, to a large extent they are, because this means a lot to Guyana. It means a lot to our development and how we move from being this third world country that no one knows about, to improving our infrastructure, the livelihoods of people and all of that. But the biggest blunder, which I return to, was the first blunder was the siphon off of this money into the central bank without informing the general public of why they collected the money and what is the purpose for that bonus.
Well, if I could turn this to you, Nick Butler. I'm sorry we lost your audio there briefly. You have worked at BP, which is a major oil company, and so you're familiar with some of the issues from sort of the other side of the table here. What do you see as the most important thing for the Guyanese government to be doing right now?
I think the first thing, Jason, is that they have to be very clear on setting the expectations of the population in the country. This is a good discovery. It's very promising, and I understand that there's probably more to be found. But if you look at the way this is going to be developed, it will take at least 3 years until there's any production. And then I would imagine that it would take another 3 years, maybe 5 years, before the companies involved have recovered their investment. So there isn't going to be a massive inflow of revenue into Guyana for 5 years or more. I think the second thing they need to be aware of is that, as I understand it, and I think Samuel's right in what he said, the skill levels in the country don't yet match what is going to be needed for this. This is a sophisticated industry, and there aren't many people trained in it. Now, I think there needs to be a program of training people so that there are jobs for Guyanan citizens, not just for Americans and other foreigners. That would be a real risk. And I think the danger, if you don't get expectations right and the
But Nick, if I
right,
could just stop you, how realistic is that? I mean, we're talking about working on an oil rig where much of the production is 120 miles offshore. I mean, is there much of that work is extremely technical and it's done by people who have spent their whole lives doing it. So it seems like it's not
Some of those jobs are going to go to foreigners, to non-Guyanan people. But I think there are quite a lot of other jobs. There's going to need to be a lot of infrastructure between the platforms and the shore. There's going to need to be processing facilities onshore. There's a lot of backup. People working on it will need housing. They'll need looking after. There are all sorts of business opportunities here, and the country has to prepare for that. And that is part of the way of getting the benefit. And then I think they don't need to develop it all at once. I'd be very strongly in favor of a depletion policy. That means you limit what you produce year by year to manage the inflow of money so that the exchange rate is not destroyed by this one single successful industry.
And Raul,
that would, if they got that wrong, that would be very bad for agriculture and jobs and other businesses in Guyana.
In other words, if there's such a huge wave of foreign currency coming into the country, their exchange rate gets out of balance and it becomes just cheaper to import many of the things that Guyana produces for itself right now, and then you would lose employment in all those different industries.
That's right. You create unemployment rather than employment. It's called the Dutch disease. There are many examples of it. I think the country should look to others to give them best advice on how to manage this and how to negotiate it with ExxonMobil. And I agree with Samuel, they should be transparent.
And Raul Gallegos, we heard Samuel talking about this contract that was negotiated with ExxonMobil and some discussion about whether or not Guyana was getting a reasonable share of the proceeds here. Obviously, in these production sharing agreements, some portion is going to go to ExxonMobil and its other oil company partners to help them sort of reimburse for the investment that they made and then make a profit. Some share is going to go to the Guyanese government. But what's the right amount?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what the actual percentage should be, but I think it is important both that the companies and the government are in sort of that either side is comfortable with the agreement that has been reached. And that also involves not just the president and his advisors, but certainly it involves educating the population about why a particular agreement was reached, what's the likelihood or reality of a renegotiation, and essentially what were the points that led to that agreement. Because as Samuel was pointing out, this is a situation where you have a new industry, a country that doesn't know about this, a population that is not familiar with the way the oil business works. And so it is imperative that the government become as transparent and as didactic as possible in every step that it is taking. Because it is very easy for the population also to think that its leaders, given that the leaders also don't have experience in managing a sophisticated oil business, could take missteps and could be taken advantage of, if you will. So it's important that there is clarity as to why certain agreements were reached. I think the interesting thing is going to be also how open both the companies and the government are to renegotiating a contract if there is widespread perception that it could have been much better for the country. We've seen the oil advisor to President Granger speaking publicly about how at least the level of the royalty should be much higher. I mean, we've seen that the CGX contract and the Exxon contract talk about a 1% royalty. We've seen the president's own advisor saying that it should be closer to 10 or 20%. Again, comparing one country to another or one oil sector to another can sometimes be comparing apples to oranges. So one has to be very careful in that regard. But there are certainly, basic standards or relatively, well-accepted standards across the industry as to why you get a certain level of royalty, a certain level of taxation, and a certain level of sort of profit sharing. In this case, we're seeing that in the case of Exxon, we're talking 50-50 sharing of profit oil. CGX is slightly more for the government, but still, I think it's important again to be as transparent as possible, as educational as possible about why certain steps are being taken,
I want to come back to this point in just a moment, Raul, but we are joined on the line by Anthony Bryan now of the University of the West Indies, who has been following this issue quite closely as well from Trinidad and Tobago. And I wanted to ask you, Anthony Bryan, particularly because Trinidad and Tobago is also a small nation that has been an oil producer for some time. What are some of the environmental concerns for a small country when you have sort of a huge offshore oil find like this?
Well, those environmental concerns are many. They really begin with the question of oil spills, the broken pipelines, ruptured barges, rig malfunctions, things like that. And Trinidad and Tobago has suffered from that in its 120 years of oil production. So I think Guyana would have to update its maritime environmental management systems and be prepared in the event of spills, I think, to sanction the exploration and production companies. There's a very bad history of the companies owning up and paying for problems like that.
And that also, I mean, when you talk about, obviously in the U.S., many people are familiar with the Deepwater Horizon spill, which caused so many problems in the Gulf of Mexico, and just the extreme difficulty in even stopping the oil from being pumped out of the ground there. Then, I mean, what does Guyana need in terms of infrastructure, in terms of ships and people to be prepared in the event that there is a significant spill?
Well, I'm not sure that Guyana would have the infrastructural capacity to deal with that. That is best dealt with by the oil companies themselves, by the IOCs. So that I think there has to be some sort of arrangement where they accept responsibility. And in the meantime, Guyana does its best with respect to putting in environmental management systems. Most of this is deep offshore oil. It is deep water oil. There is nothing on land, and so the idea of land spills is not there. However, the effects of any spillage offshore is going to affect the shore of Guyana, and like everywhere else, they have to be prepared to deal with it.
Well, Nick Butler, if I could turn this to you. I mean, I think one of the themes that keeps coming up again and again that we heard from Samuel and from Raul and Anthony and from yourself is that there is this sort of imbalance in sort of capacity between ExxonMobil. I mean, that's a company with $250 billion a year in revenues. Guyana is a country with a $3 billion a year economy. How can they sort of work these issues out equally? How do major oil companies view their sort of moral, ethical responsibilities in situations like this?
Well, I think most of the companies do realize now that there is an issue of mutual advantage here. There's a lot of oil. If it's going to continue to be developed, and I think we're only at an early stage, these are the first finds. There could be quite a few more. I think Exxon actually have a good track record around the world of working with local countries, helping them to design the facilities they need, as Professor Bryan says, on the environmental side, on the safety side. But they need to come together to do it. But there are things that only the government of Guyana can do. And I think they need to start doing them now. They haven't got experience in this. I think they should draw on the experience of other countries. I was in Norway last week, and the Norwegians were saying they would be happy to help. They actually have a fund that goes to countries that have just discovered oil, which helps them to do the right thing, to gather the skills, to train people, to understand the challenges. And I think Guyana should look outwards, take advice, be transparent, and then work on an open basis with the company to get the right answer.
And Raul Gallegos, we heard, obviously we discussed some countries that have had a number of problems, major problems after their oil find. Nick Butler just mentioned Norway. Are there some examples of countries that have handled their oil wealth really successfully, and sort of is there a clear, easily explainable roadmap for how to do that?
Well, I think there's a number of countries, and not only oil countries, but also, resource-rich countries like Chile, for instance, with copper, that have set up funds to save some of the money for a rainy day, to invest that properly so that you have returns that can benefit both the population and the government. You have the case of Alaska, the state of Alaska in the United States, for instance, that has a fund where no one can touch the capital of the fund, and residents get a check every year from the returns of the fund, and that turns citizens into watchdogs of how the oil sector is being managed, and also forces politicians to do more with less, if you will. But there's no ready roadmap, if you will. I think it's very tricky for, as we spoke earlier, for countries that already have the oil flowing to try to set up that infrastructure, because by then there are certain interests that have either control of the money, or you have politicians trying to remain popular and use that money to maintain popularity, etc. So it's important that you have the infrastructure in place beforehand. Ideally, obviously, you cannot always do that, but in this particular case, since you have so many years in leeway to think about how to manage it, I think Guyana has a unique opportunity to set up that legal infrastructure before oil flows.
And Anthony, Bryan, if I could turn this to you, Raul made a number of good points there, but I was interested in particular, given that Guyana is a multi-party democracy, how great do you see the risks are that the political elite will try to just sort of capture these funds, and the oil will just become sort of a source of corruption and help them perpetuate their own power, similar to what's happened in Venezuela and other countries?
Well, I think it's a great possibility. One of the things is that politics in Guyana, whose population is 29% Afro-Guyanese and 40% Indo-Guyanese, they divide along racial lines. The two main ethnic groups compete over money and power. So I think that there will be a test of that, certainly by the presidential election of 2020. It'll be a serious test for political stability as well as for money and power.
Because whoever wins that 2020 election is going to be in power when the first oil money starts coming in.
Exactly the point. Who will be in power, and who will be able to feast on the resources. I wouldn't, immediately accrue any sort of corruption influences on either of the governments, but some recent opinion polls done in Guyana show that the Guyanese public has very little faith in the leadership, either government or opposition, to do the right thing. So like everywhere else, they run the risk initially of those corrupting influences taking hold.
That's going to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA, Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Samuel Sukhnandan, Raul Gallegos, Anthony Bryan, and Nick Butler for joining us. Our assistant producers this week are Rosemary Belson and Teodora Agarici, with supervising producer Idom Kasaye. Jiwan Choi is visual editor, and Aaron Hay is audio engineer. Our director is Travis McMillan. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason Mclure. Thanks for tuning in.